Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we contemplate the state of our world and the US election, everything in our world is interconnected. Everything in our world is comprehensively one. And yet, in our world of appearances, we've never been more separated, and we've never been more at odds with each other and with the larger ecosystem. Today, I would like to contemplate the US elections coming up next Tuesday within the context of our state of the world. I believe that once one sees the interconnectivity, one better understands not only what's at stake, but where the US fits now in the overall global framework. I want to touch first on what's going on in the Middle East. Then I want to touch on what's going on in Ukraine. Then I want to talk a little bit about the BRICS coalition and the aftermath of the BRICS meeting in Kazan, Russia last week. And then I want to turn to the US elections within the context of a seminal article that was just published by Neil Ferguson. Let's start with the Middle East. As you know from my comments a few days ago, many commentators have been deeply probing the last Israeli attack on Iran. The attack was heralded by the Israelis as a devastating blow that would be sudden, comprehensive, concise, and was intended to cut off the head of the snake. I reported that the plan was a decapitation strike that was worked out with the United States, had the approval of President Biden and presumably Vice President Harris. And then out of nowhere, about 10 days before the strike actually happened, there was a leak in the Pentagon by someone in the military that revealed what the decapitation strike was supposed to involve. The initial interpretive framework was that the Israelis backed down because the cat was out of the bag. But Alistair Crook, who's a very seasoned British diplomat and statesman who has been deeply immersed in the Middle East for decades, speaks the local languages, is as familiar with Hamas and Hezbollah as he is with the Israelis, knows the Iranians. He has very recently on the Duran spoken about his analysis of what went on. And I think it's very important for us all to take in. Because if you recall that when the Israelis first dealt with the Iranians back in June, July, there was a celebrations at the devastation of the Israelis and the ability of the Israelis to withstand the Iranian attack. None of that is happening now. Why? According to Alistair Crook, what took place is as follows. The Israelis and the Americans did, in fact, launch a decapitation strike. And it was supposed to come in a series, in waves against the Iranians. In violation of Syrian and Iraqi airspace, the Jordanians gave them permission. The Israeli fighter craft took off and were launching their missiles. And then two things happened. One, the Iranian equivalent of the Iron Dome, which protects Israel, was activated. And very few of the missiles got in and did only minor damage. Number two, more unnerving for the Israelis and the Americans. As soon as the Israeli craft were off the ground, they were being tracked by radar, which means they could be hit with precision. And once the Israelis and the Americans realized that the Iranian air defense system was countering what they were throwing at it, and that their aircraft, their stealth bombers and all the kind of stealth technology that's available to the United States and the Israelis was being tracked and could be shot down, they retreated. And that's why that last attack on Iran ended in a whimper, not a roar. What was the critical difference in the Iranian now growing power in the Middle East, which now has decisively both responded to the Israelis in ways that have been far in excess of anything the Americans and the Israelis expected, and now can protect itself against the most sophisticated American-Israeli missile attacks? What's going on? What's going on is Russia. Russia is now moving into the Middle East. At the Kazan meeting, the BRICS meeting, Iran, which is now being integrated into the BRICS, along with several dozen other countries. Vladimir Putin met with the president of Iran, Peshkian, and announced a major strategic agreement, the beginning of military cooperation and support. Peshkian also met with the Chinese. The Chinese are now backing the Iranians. The Saudis, formerly bitter enemies of the Iranians, are now quietly neutral. And what we're beginning to observe in an increasingly explicit way is that it is not the United States that's the most powerful military nation on earth. It's Russia. And I know this is so contrary to everything that we've been taught and believed to be true, that it's worth just contemplating in the following way. And in order to understand that, we need to move to Ukraine. In order to understand the context of what has taken place in Ukraine, it's important to bear in mind some facts that are deeply disturbing about the current state of readiness of the United States. Last year, the US military budget exceeded $1 trillion. Last year, the military budget of Russia was at 50 billion. The US military budget is 20 times as big as the Russian military budget. In fact, if you include China, that spends about 250 million a year, with France and England and Turkey and India and Brazil and Saudi Arabia and the top dozen countries, they don't get to the trillion that the US spends keeping 100 bases in 127 countries, some 700-800 bases around the world, 250 bases around China, and all over Africa. Italy alone has 100 US bases. That's how dense the US military power is in Europe. 100 bases, more than even in Germany. And this is one reason why the United States just blew off Putin when he said, this is a red line. And he repeatedly asked for negotiations so that, in the spirit of Gorbachev and Yeltsin before him, there could be a comprehensive understanding, a comprehensive framework between Europe, Russia, the United States. The United States wasn't interested. They want to break up Russia, as you know from my previous teach-ins and presentations on Ukraine. It didn't occur to anybody in the United States that the Russians could even mount the military incursion into Ukraine. They didn't think they would do that. The most common caricature of Russia in the US political class is that Russia is a gas station surrounded by a lot of territory with a minuscule economic capacity and a dilapidated Soviet relic military. That's why the United States wasn't concerned when they pushed NATO east. They knew the Russians couldn't do anything about it. And that's why when they went into Ukraine, trying to destabilize Ukraine and bring it into the NATO orbit, and overthrew in 2014 the neutral government of Ukraine and put in place a pro-West, anti-Russian government, they assumed that the Russians in the end were going to back down because there wasn't anything they could do. 2 years later, what we have seen is that Russia was not only capable of a military incursion, it was capable of seizing all the land that was required in those 4 oblasts in southern and eastern Ukraine to give it the land bridge to Crimea. And it was capable of withstanding all the military hardware that the United States and NATO poured into Ukraine in the expectation that this was going to finish the Russians off very quickly. It didn't happen. The Abrams tanks, the Bradley tanks, the Shadowhawk missiles, the various systems of surface to air, the Patriot missile systems, etc., basically didn't work. Why? Well, there are many reasons, but a principal reason is that because of the corruption in the US military industrial complex, where weapon systems are more about who gets the contract than about military efficiency. What you have happen in military system after military system is a composite group of corporations, each motivated by profit and minimal efficiency. And they're given complete permission to charge the Pentagon and the US taxpayer anything they want. You get weapon systems that don't work. They're not designed to work. They're designed to spread the military contracts into every congressional district in the United States, get all the big corporations involved. And you get, as they say, a camel is a horse designed by a committee. And that's why the US vaunted military machine is not able to function at a level of military efficiency to defeat Russia. The Russian military machine is the opposite. It's designed largely simply so that it works. The tanks and the jeeps and the troop transport carriers and the airplanes are designed to be easily fixed. And the sophistication of the radar systems and their surface-to-air missiles are without peer, as the West is now discovering. Another aspect of what's been going on in Ukraine is the immaturity of President Zelensky, who was a comedian, had zero military or political experience, and he's now the commander-in-chief of Ukraine. And he's making all the mistakes of amateurs. The Russians have been fighting wars for 1,000 years. They know how to fight war. The military academies of Russia in Moscow and St. Petersburg are considered by military analysts among the best in the world. They have a strategic doctrine of aggressive attrition. That's why you don't hear much about Ukraine in the news. There's nothing spectacular that's going on. And the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians and the Americans what the Russians did to the Germans and the French in World War II and back in 1812 with the Napoleonic invasions of Russia. They just wear you down. They just kill your soldiers. They just inexorably push you back. Zelensky, in the face of the Russian movement to the West, made the classic mistake of a novice. A number of his generals said, you need to strategically retreat against the Russians so that there's a chance of building defense perimeters and engaging in strategic deployment of troops. But Zelensky's gotten in his head that the Ukrainians need to defend every inch of a Ukrainian territory independent of its strategic value. And they've been slaughtered at the tune of around 30,000 troops a month, sometimes more, killed or wounded. And that number, 30,000, is the number of men that volunteer for the Russian army every month. So while the Ukrainians are having 30,000 plus or minus killed or wounded, the Russians are bringing in volunteers at 30,000 a month. And because they're much more skillful on the battlefield, their casualty rate is a fraction of the Ukrainians. Ukrainians tried to mobilize, but they can't mobilize because most of the young men in Ukraine have fled. 750,000 young people have fled Ukraine. People are hiding in the basements. No one wants to go to the front line. And the Russians are realizing, as are the Chinese and the BRICS countries, that as Mao Zedong said many, many decades ago, the United States is actually a paper tiger. And we're seeing it in the Middle East. We've seen it for 2 years in Ukraine, and it has been projected by German intelligence a few days ago that over the next 3 months, Russia will probably be at the Dnieper River, Ukraine. Goes kind of south from Kiev and then goes to the west. And if the Russians go all the way to the Dnieper River, Ukraine is basically done. Most of the industrial, mineral-rich part of Ukraine is east of the Dnieper, and what is west of the Dnieper is farmland. So Ukraine will become a rump of what it used to be. I won't go into the negotiations that may or may not take place, but the President Zelensky is refusing in any way to negotiate. He keeps talking about his victory plan, that the Russians have to withdraw completely. They have to pay reparations, and Ukrainians are going to fight to the last man. And the Russians are saying, that's absurd. We're going to keep all the land we've taken, those 4 oblasts in eastern and southern Ukraine. That's now Russia. Those have been absorbed into Russia. That's Russian territory now. They may take Kharkiv in the north. They may take Odessa, Zaporozhye in the south and west. If they take Odessa, that means Ukraine will not have access to the Black Sea, and it'll be essentially a land-bound state and economically essentially unviable. All that is now before the Russians, according to German intelligence. And they give it 2 to 3 months, maybe longer, depending, for the final collapse to take place. Ukrainian troops are deserting day by day. Battalions and squadrons are refusing to take orders. They are, in many cases, routed as Zelensky and Syrsky, the commanding general, refuse to give up an inch of Ukrainian territory, even if it means that the Ukrainian troops are surrounded and just being massacred, essentially, because they have nowhere to go and nowhere to run. The Russian drones, they completely control the airspace. It's a horrendous situation going on in Ukraine. It breaks your heart. In many of the same ways that it breaks your heart what's going on with the Israelis and the Palestinians. It just breaks your heart. The Ukrainians are just getting slaughtered. Breaks your heart. Doubly, when you take in that the United States is now in the process of walking away. You remember about 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, Biden made a very kind of unheralded trip to Germany. He met with Scholz. He was given a medal of European honor. He met with Keir Starmer, who flew in from Great Britain, the Prime Minister of Britain, and others, Macron, and so forth. And in those quiet deliberations, the Americans basically signaled that they're done. They're done. I think Biden said, we'll give you another 20 billion just because. But it's clear that the United States is in the process of walking away from Ukraine as it walked away from Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, Libya, Syria, scores of countries. After devastation has been completed, the Americans just walk away. I said this 2 years ago. I said, this is what's going to happen. The Russians are going to win. The United States is going to fight to the last Ukrainian. And then at some point, the Americans are just going to walk away. And that was the message that Biden gave to the Europeans. It's up to you now. It's your problem. And that leads me to the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa coalition that emerged about 10 years ago or less as an attempt by these countries, Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, to try to begin a process of forming a non-US dominated coalition that would emphasize trade, emphasize cultural and strategic cooperation. And the BRICS have been growing and growing and growing. And when I talked about the BRICS last week in the conference that they were having in Kazan, I said that there were a number of commentators that were saying that the Kazan conference was going to be the most important event in 2024, not the US election, not even Israel and Palestine, not Ukraine, which dominate the news. It's the BRICS. Because all the while that the Russians have been taking on the Americans in Europe, in Ukraine, the BRICS have been developing an alternative global financial framework outside of US control. The most fundamental constitutive part of which is leaving the US dollar zone and begin to trade in local currencies, in the ruble, in the yuan, in the various currencies of the member states, and to begin to put together an alternative to the SWIFT system, which is basically the credit card system, and put in place the beginnings of a portfolio of currencies and commodities like gold to create a whole new basis outside of the US, outside of the IMF and the World Bank and the GATT and the WTO, all US dominated international financial institutions that have, over the last 80 years, controlled the global economy, kept the US dollar as the central currency of exchange, and created throughout the global South what they call export platforms, where they basically strong-arm the local countries into serving as export platforms to the consumers in the United States and in Western Europe, which impoverishes the global South, creates a completely artificial abundance in the West. And the main achievement of Kazan is that architecture is now in place and beginning to be implemented. How long it will take is unclear. It may be quick, it may be slow. But the geostrategic balance of the world is now shifting from the United States and Western Europe in irrevocable ways. The European economy is in a state of decline, particularly the German economy. The entire basis of European economic growth and German competitive edge in the world was the cheap gas that they were getting from Russia through the Nord Stream pipeline, which was blown up by the executive order of Joe Biden and the CIA in the greatest act of industrial sabotage in history, 2021. That released more methane into the atmosphere than ever in recorded history. Volkswagen is now closing automotive factories for the first time in the entire history of Volkswagen. And virtually every economy in Europe is either quiescent or in decline as the sanctions against Russia and the sanctions against China and the sanctions against all the people that are helping Russia don't have any impact on the Russians or the Chinese because they're trading with each other. It only serves to cut the United States and Europe off from the trading partners. Who in their right mind wants to have sanctions and hostility with China right now? But that's what the Europeans have allowed themselves to be talked into by the United States. Just yesterday, the US Treasury Department announced several hundred new sanctions against all the people that they've found out there that are trading with Russia. It's suicide. The Russian economy is booming. They're dealing with some of the challenges of overgrowth. It's an extraordinary situation, which leads me to the current state of the United States and the election coming up. And I wanted to set this context because what's going on in the United States right now was distilled by an article that Neil Ferguson released a week or two ago, basically entitled, "We're All Soviets Now." It's kind of a shocking title. What do you mean the United States is like the Soviet Union? And I want to just go through what Neil Ferguson has said. He's a British politician. He lives now in Southern California. He's a conservative politician, but he's a public intellectual and has a very incisive mind. The first thing he says is that, remember back in the Brezhnev days, Chernenko and Andropov in the early 1980s, the 70s and 80s, it was a gerontocracy. These guys were so old they could barely make it to the end of the block. Brezhnev was a chain smoker, and you looked, he was all hunched over, and the Soviet Union by the 1970s and 1980s was being governed by a bunch of old men. Joe Biden is 82 and barely compos mentis. We all know that. He just came out in public to make a statement, and he completely blew it by calling Trump supporters garbage while he was decrying the comedian at Madison Square Garden a few days before that was talking about Puerto Rico as garbage. So rather than solving the problem, the president complicated it, which has enabled Trump to solidify his base. Ferguson points out that if Trump wins, he'll be 82 at the end of 4 years. He also points out that the US Senate and the US House of Representatives is the oldest. If you take the average senator and congressional representative, the Congress of the United States is much older than any other country, any other legislature in the industrial world, probably in the whole world. We're being governed. Nancy Pelosi is like in her 80s. Chuck Schumer is old. All these guys are old people. And that's worth just noting as we ponder the current state of our election. The second thing that he talks about is the constraints, the soft constraints that inhibit a country from acting. It's what Arnold Toynbee in his history of his story of history talks about, the lack of elasticity. In the Soviet Union at that time, it was the bloated bureaucracy that was completely out of control, didn't even have an internal audit system. So the Soviet elite, these old men governing, not only didn't even know what was going on, but they were constrained in whatever they could do because there was no disposable revenue, state funds. Currently in the United States this year, the interest that we are paying on our $35 trillion national debt is bigger than the defense budget. That has never happened before. And that's just the interest on the debt. And if you look at the Habsburg, you look at the British Empire, you look at the Ottoman Empire, you look at the Dutch Empire, they all begin to collapse when these soft constraints superseded their ability to act proactively in the world. You see it in Ukraine. You see it in the Middle East. The United States has no more capacity to act. And it's now a victim of events, not an actor proactively causing events as much as it would like. The third point that Ferguson makes is the collapse of civic virtue and the rise of what he called the culture of despair, deaths of despair. What builds a country, the Puritan ethic, Go west, young man, go west. The esprit de corps of the pioneers. That no longer happens in the United States. Everybody is primarily concerned about creature comforts and their entitlements. But the culture of despair now in the United States is so pervasive that if you take the number of people who have committed suicide and died of drug overdoses, it exceeds the number of deaths from COVID. If you add those suicides, drug overdoses with alcohol-related deaths, you get a number of deaths that are far in excess of anything that we recorded in this pandemic that caused the entire nation to shut down, and as a result of which 1.2 million people died. And this is now happening on a regular basis. And what Ferguson points out is that this, we know, we've had many programs on Humanity Rising about how drug abuse, drug addiction, self-harm, anxieties, depressions, domestic violence are affecting the young people. But the data is now showing that it's affecting the older people as much as the younger people. And that the death rate, the mortality rate, particularly of men in the United States, is just going down, down, down. It's particularly acute in the Rust Belt, those areas like in Ohio and Pennsylvania, which are now swing states, where they used to be vibrant, dynamic manufacturing. But in the 1980s, the United States made one of the most catastrophic mistakes in its history, where Wall Street and Washington decided, let's let China, let's let those global South countries do the manufacturing. We're going to control the finances. And so that's exactly what happened. We intentionally destroyed our manufacturing base in America because Wall Street wanted to make more money through financial instruments. And so now China is the big behemoth. I think I read somewhere that the Chinese economy and what it can produce is bigger than the United States and the G7 combined. Think about that. One of the reasons why we can't support Ukraine anymore and we're walking away is because we no longer have the military capacity to build the systems and produce the artillery shells that are required. We don't have that capacity anymore. That's why the Pentagon's been trying to get South Korea and Israel and Japan to give the Ukrainians artillery and weapon systems, because the United States no longer has the capacity to build it. Because the $1 trillion is going into the big corporations that are just gorging themselves with profits and not building war-efficient weaponry. And the dollar is about ready to erode. So the situation in the United States in terms of the culture of despair and these deaths of despair are escalating among the old and among the young, and particularly among men in the so-called Rust Belt, which is the core support of Trump. And that leads to the election. If you look at history, starting with Plato's Republic and ancient Athens, the decline and fall of an imperium, when, as I've just indicated, a country seemingly at its most powerful is actually being so corrupted within that its end is nigh, as the rest of the world understands that this is a paper tiger now. And the time is now to move and set up a whole new center of gravity around Russia and China and India and Brazil and South Africa and Iran and the BRICS countries. Upwards of 100 countries are wanting to join the BRICS, including Turkey. You take Turkey out of NATO, and you've got a problem if you're NATO. What happens, says Plato, is that in this confusion of what he calls mob rule, you can call it plutocracy, the oligarchy, rule of the rich, the big corporations, however you want to call it. He called it mob rule, where no one pays attention to the good of the state. One only pays attention to my good and my profit. He says, in the end, that causes this culture of despair. And out of this culture of despair comes the demagogue. And that's what happened with Germany in the 1930s, out of that culture of despair. Germany, it's worth noting, Germany in 1928 was dynamic. And the Nazis, I think, only got 3 or 4% of the vote. Then the Great Depression hit. And in 3 years, the entire German economy collapsed. And then came the demagogue. Then came the tyrant. And that's what Plato predicts is the tyrant. The strength of Donald Trump, which is not understood by progressives, most of the people on this call. I'm a progressive. I believe in fundamental human values of compassion, goodwill, inclusion, ecological sensitivity and alignment, as we all do. But if you're in the culture of despair and there's no job and you can't provide for your family and you feel that you're being ripped off and the elites in Washington are going into foreign areas and engaging in completely senseless wars, spending hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, but you're getting a welfare check of $128 a month. You're ready for the tyrant. You're ready for someone who's going to come in and take charge and wipe out all these progressives who've led us to war and are ripping us off as progressives are being caricatured. Democrats are being caricatured. It doesn't matter to the Trump supporters that he's in cognitive decline, which is obvious, like Biden. It doesn't matter that he's incapable of sustained thought and meanders all over the place. So the things that offend the Democrats are the things that don't matter a whit to the Republicans because they're motivated by authoritarian power. They want someone to drain the swamp. They want someone who can take charge and get those bad guys. And that's why they say this election is the closest election maybe in American history. The last closest election was the Kennedy-Nixon in 1960. It was so close. That's what we're heading into next Tuesday. And I want to make some comments and then we'll close. So you have clarity on the Republican side. Trump's very clear. The people around him are even more clear. Trump wins. This is the end of our republic as we know it, in my view. I don't think the American institutions are any longer capable of the elasticity, to go back to Toynbee, or the imagination to counter the tyrant if he wins. The issue on the other side is that we have a candidate in Kamala Harris who is clearly, at least in my view, in the view of many commentators, not the one in charge. Remember, she was put in. She didn't run in any primaries. She was put in what was essentially a coup against Joe Biden by the powers that be in the Democratic Party, mostly the donor class. So if you look at the polling data, people don't really trust Kamala. They know what they know about Trump. They're not quite sure what they're going to get with Kamala. They have this feeling that it's going to be the same old as we got with Joe Biden, the gerontocracy. The pillaging of America by the wealthy corporate class, the indifference of the political class, and the continued erosion and impoverishization of the middle class and the underclass. So as we fathom this, I've been trying to, in my own mind, because I'm still one of those undecideds. In my own mind, I certainly couldn't vote for Trump. But given the Biden-Harris proactive support of genocide in Gaza, I can't in good conscience vote that side. And I've been really trying to fathom, is there any way that I could vote for Kamala Harris? Because we're in one of those elections that's so close, voting for a third party, you may represent your conscience, but you know it won't make any difference. As I've been pondering it, I want to offer something, which is my concluding point. Then I'll summarize. I think that the fundamental issue that would compel one to vote for Kamala Harris, knowing full well her support for genocide and her being a tool of the war machine, which is obvious, is the fact that if Trump gets in, not only are we going to have a full-scale attack against the Republic, we're going to have a full-scale attack against women. And if Kamala comes in, I believe that she would fervently do everything she can to restore Roe v. Wade, to restore a woman's sovereignty over her own body. And so in the end, this election is not just about the politics of an imperium in decline, which neither Trump nor Harris are going to stop, in my view. It's ultimately, I think, about what we need to do as human beings to protect women. Because that's our mothers. That's our sisters. That's our daughters. And so this may be one of those elections, as it was back in 2020, when it was the Black women coming out in Georgia. Remember Georgia? That gave it to Biden. So I believe that this election, in its most fundamental level, is about protecting women. And that's why when I get right down to looking at my ballot, I'll probably cast it for Kamala Harris, despite my reservations. Because it's not conceivable to me that in this day and age, we would offer women up on the altar of prejudice and male patriarchy. That's insane. The world is very complex. The world is ripping itself apart. The United States is collapsing militarily, politically, morally, economically, financially. And the only reason why it's being propped up is we're paying for almost everything by acquiring more debt. All of Ukraine, all our support for Israel is coming out of debt. It's just paper money being printed. And that's why we're at $35 trillion in debt, and we're increasing it by $1 trillion every 3 to 4 months. Because this whole massive stock market extravaganza that you're seeing is all based on debt. That's how fragile this house of cards is, called the United States of America. And the rest of the world sees it. And that's why I've said before that I believe that the debacle in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza are the death knells of Pax Americana, and a new world is trying to rise up. And here in America, the one thing that I think we need to salvage, if we can, is to at least protect the right of women over their own bodies. So thank you, everyone. for listening to me today as I've pondered on the state of the world and the U.S. election coming up. I hope that I haven't been too provocative. As I always say, I speak passionately about what I believe, but I do everything in the spirit of truth pursued, not truth possessed. And I hope that we will ponder these things, and every woman out there needs to vote in this election, no matter where you are, if you're in the United States. That's the one thing worth saving. It's the one thing that can be saved. Now, tomorrow, we have a very special session. I met yesterday with a little girl, 7, who's this precocious contactee and experiencer who has a regular communication and actually speaks in the language of the blue avians, special kind of ET. And her mother was there, and I was so entranced. I said, would you be willing to come on Humanity Rising? And she said, yes, the blue avians have been telling me I need to speak out more. So tomorrow, we're going to have an 8-year-old girl talk to us about the ETs and her experience. It's going to be fascinating. She's an extraordinary being. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to join the after chat for just a bit. If you're wanting to deepen our dialogue about the state of the world and the U.S. elections, and then we'll see you tomorrow for our dialogue with 7 on Humanity Rising. Thank you all so much. I so appreciate the quality of our dialogue. Love you all. Bye for now.